Prisons were once imagined as places of correction, institutions meant to transform wrongdoing into responsibility through structure and reflection. Over centuries, however, many prisons evolved into something far more disturbing. Instead of restoring balance, they became instruments of fear, engineered to intimidate entire populations. In the world's most notorious jails, justice was not the priority. Control was. These facilities were designed to dominate bodies, erase identities, and remind society that authority, when unchallenged, can be absolute. Behind thick walls and locked steel doors, cruelty often became routine. Guards exercised unchecked power, rules shifted without explanation, and punishment replaced procedure. Prisoners were stripped of names and reduced to numbers. Personal histories disappeared. Uniforms replaced individuality. In such environments, suffering was not an accident or a failure of the system. It was embedded deliberately, maintained through silence, obedience, and fear. Throughout history, notorious prisons emerged during moments of political instability, revolution, or authoritarian rule. Leaders learned that incarceration could function as psychological warfare. Imprisonment did not merely remove opponents from society. It erased them from public memory. Families were left without answers. Communities were warned without words. The prison walls themselves became symbols of consequence. Secrecy allowed abuse to flourish. The public rarely saw inside these institutions, and when they did, it was often through carefully controlled narratives. Distance bred indifference. Prisoners became abstract figures rather than human beings. Without transparency, accountability vanished, and cruelty became normalized under the language of security and discipline. These prisons were not only reflections of law, but mirrors of societal values. They revealed how easily fear could justify excess, and how quickly moral boundaries could erode when suffering was hidden. Many of the mechanisms developed in historic prisons remain alive today, modernized through technology, yet driven by the same logic of domination. To understand the world's most notorious jails is to confront an uncomfortable truth. When punishment becomes spectacle, justice loses its purpose. When suffering is concealed behind walls, it reshapes the moral limits of society that allows it. And when silence becomes policy, cruelty no longer needs justification. It simply continues. The Bastille loomed over Paris not merely as a prison, but as a warning carved in stone. Its towers and walls symbolized royal authority exercised without restraint, a place where the king's power reached beyond law and reason. For ordinary citizens, the Bastille was less a physical structure than an idea, a reminder that resistance could vanish behind walls from which few stories escaped. Unlike conventional prisons, the Bastille operated through royal orders known as lettres de cachet. With a single sealed document, a person could be arrested and imprisoned indefinitely, without charge or trial. Political critics, outspoken writers, troublesome nobles, and even disobedient family members could be erased from public life overnight. Justice was replaced by convenience, and imprisonment became an extension of personal power. Conditions inside the Bastille reflected the inequalities of the society that built it. Wealthy prisoners could afford furniture, books, fine meals, and servants. Poor inmates were thrown into cold, damp cells infested with rats and insects, where sunlight rarely entered. The prison reinforced social hierarchy even in captivity, reminding inmates that class dictated suffering. The most devastating punishment, however, was uncertainty. Prisoners rarely knew why they had been arrested or how long they would remain confined. Days passed without explanation. Months turned into years. Some inmates forgot the faces of loved ones. Others lost their sense of time entirely. The Bastille specialized not in physical torture, but in psychological erosion. Despite its fearsome reputation, the Bastille often held relatively few prisoners. Yet its influence extended far beyond its walls. The threat of the Bastille was enough to silence dissent across France. Fear accomplished what guards and chains could not. On July 14, 1789, revolutionaries stormed the prison. They found only 7 inmates. Yet the fall of the Bastille ignited the French Revolution. Its destruction mattered not because of who was freed, but because of what was destroyed, the symbol of unchecked authority. The Bastille teaches a lasting lesson. Power sustained by secrecy eventually collapses under its own weight. When prisons exist to protect authority rather than justice, they become monuments to fear. And when fear governs society, revolution waits patiently for its moment. Rising from the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz Island appeared less like a prison and more like a monument to despair. Officially designated as a federal penitentiary for the most dangerous criminals, Alcatraz served a deeper purpose. It was an experiment in psychological control, built to test how isolation, silence, and hopelessness could discipline men deemed beyond reform. Alcatraz was designed to be inescapable. The surrounding waters were icy, the currents treacherous, and the distance to shore unforgiving. Yet escape was not the prison's true weapon. The real punishment began once inmates entered their cells. Each prisoner was confined to a narrow space of steel bars, a bed, a sink with cold water, and a toilet. Comfort was deliberately absent. Silence defined daily life. Prisoners were forbidden from speaking during meals and work periods. Conversations were restricted, human contact minimized, and emotional expression discouraged. Many inmates later described the sound of the sea as torture. They could hear laughter, music, and life drifting from the mainland, reminders of freedom permanently out of reach. The most feared location was D Block, where solitary confinement was enforced with ruthless precision. Inmates placed here were isolated from all human interaction. The infamous strip cell intensified the punishment further. Prisoners were kept in darkness, stripped of clothing and fed minimal rations. Time lost meaning. Days blurred together. Sanity often followed. Former prisoners reported hallucinations, paranoia, and severe depression. Some spoke to imaginary companions. Others screamed into the void, desperate to hear their own voices. Alcatraz demonstrated that the human mind deteriorates rapidly when deprived of connection. The prison rarely used physical violence, yet its psychological impact endured long after release. Although Alcatraz operated for only 29 years, its reputation outlived its existence. It became a symbol of ultimate punishment, reserved for those society wished to forget. Even after its closure, the prison's mythology continued to shape public perception of justice and control. Alcatraz teaches a chilling lesson. When isolation becomes policy, punishment no longer corrects behavior. It erodes identity. The prison proved that silence can be as destructive as chains and loneliness as devastating as any weapon humanity has ever created. Robben Island was chosen precisely because it was cut off from the world. Located several miles off the coast of Cape Town, surrounded by cold, unforgiving waters, it was intended to isolate South Africa's most dangerous prisoners from society. Under the apartheid regime, danger did not mean violent criminals. It meant thinkers, activists, and voices that challenged a racial order holding the country together through fear. Political prisoners sent to Robben Island were meant to disappear. The prison stripped them of identity, dignity, and connection. Inmates wore thin uniforms against harsh winds and were housed in cramped cells with minimal bedding. Communication with the outside world was tightly controlled. Letters were censored or delayed for months. Visits were rare, brief, and closely monitored, turning family contact into another instrument of control. Hard labor formed the backbone of punishment. Prisoners were forced to work in a limestone quarry under relentless sunlight. The white glare reflected into their eyes day after day, permanently damaging eyesight. Many former inmates later suffered vision problems for life. The work itself served no meaningful purpose. Its aim was exhaustion, obedience, and humiliation. Even food became a tool of apartheid. Rations were distributed based on race, with black prisoners receiving less and lower quality meals than others. The message was clear. Racial hierarchy did not end at the prison gate. It was enforced at every level of existence, even in captivity. Yet Robben Island failed in its most important mission. Instead of breaking resistance, it strengthened it. Prisoners educated one another in secret, sharing banned books, political theories, and personal experiences. Cells became classrooms. Conversations whispered through bars became lessons in resilience. The prison evolved into what inmates later called a university of the struggle. Nelson Mandela's 18 years on Robben Island transformed him into a symbol of endurance rather than defeat. His calm resistance and refusal to surrender dignity inspired fellow inmates and, eventually, the world beyond the island. When apartheid finally collapsed, Robben Island stood exposed as a moral failure. Today it is a museum, preserved not to glorify suffering, but to warn against it. The prison proves that while bodies can be confined, ideas cannot. Even the harshest isolation cannot fully extinguish the human will to resist injustice. Carandiru Prison in Sao Paulo, Brazil, was infamous not for its architecture, but for its sheer scale and the chaos it housed within. Designed to hold around 3,000 inmates, it frequently contained over 7,000, turning corridors into congested arteries and cells into overcrowded cells that were breeding grounds for tension, violence, and disease. Overcrowding amplified existing rivalries and created a volatile environment where survival depended on alliance, cunning, and brute force. Guards struggled to maintain order. Their authority was undermined by gangs who controlled different wings, distributing food, enforcing rules, and meting out punishment. The prison became a law unto itself. Life inside was defined by constant negotiation, territorial disputes, and the constant threat of violence. Every day, inmates navigated a landscape shaped by both fear and necessity. In 1992, Carandiru erupted into tragedy. A riot broke out, sparked by tensions that had been simmering for months. Military police stormed the facility to suppress the disturbance. The result was catastrophic. 111 prisoners were killed, many shot at close range. No officers died, and accountability was minimal. This massacre became emblematic of the failures inherent in overcrowded, mismanaged penal systems, where a single spark could ignite unthinkable violence. Living conditions were abysmal even outside of moments of crisis. Medical care was inadequate, hygiene was poor, and malnutrition was rampant. Inmates faced daily threats to physical safety, often from fellow prisoners. For many, Carandiru was not a place of rehabilitation, but an arena in which only the most adaptable survived. Despite these horrors, Carandiru's existence prompted national and international reflection on the role of prisons in society. The facility was eventually demolished, but its legacy remains. It serves as a grim reminder that when prisons become overcrowded, mismanaged, and unchecked, the risk of catastrophe escalates. Carandiru teaches that neglect and mismanagement are as dangerous as criminal intent within the walls. The prison also raises questions about the societal factors that contribute to mass incarceration, poverty, social inequality, and the criminalization of marginalized communities. Carandiru was more than a prison. It was a microcosm of societal neglect, reflecting structural issues that extended far beyond its walls. Understanding Carandiru is essential for understanding the human cost of mismanaged justice systems. Its story is a chilling illustration of chaos, desperation, and the limits of control when society abandons its responsibility to protect all citizens, including those behind bars. Deep within the Colorado Rockies stands ADX Florence, a prison designed not only to confine, but to dominate the psyche. Known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, it houses inmates deemed too dangerous or disruptive for the general population. Here, control is absolute and human contact is minimized to near impossibility. Inmates spend up to 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, where silence, monotony, and the absence of routine human interaction become the primary forms of punishment. Cells are small, stark, and soundproof. A single meal is passed through a slot in the door, and every interaction is monitored. Prisoners wear clothes that strip individuality, follow regimented schedules, and are rarely allowed recreation outside of isolated cages. Even minimal gestures, like eye contact, are controlled and limited. The architecture itself enforces obedience through intimidation. Solitary confinement, long used at ADX Florence, is recognized as a psychological weapon. Prolonged isolation can induce anxiety, depression, paranoia, hallucinations, and emotional collapse. For some inmates, the line between reality and delusion blurs over months and years. Guards enforce silence, and time is disorienting. The prison effectively becomes a psychological experiment in endurance, testing human limits under conditions of extreme deprivation. Supporters argue that ADX Florence is necessary for public safety. Many inmates are convicted terrorists, serial killers, and organized crime leaders. The facility ensures that they cannot harm others or organize further criminal activity. Yet critics question whether such measures cross moral boundaries. noting that prolonged isolation is recognized by psychologists as a form of cruel and unusual punishment. The prison system at ADX Florence is designed to erase autonomy. Personal identity is reduced to a number. Movements, speech, and even posture are regulated. The goal is to maintain order through psychological control, but at the cost of human dignity. For inmates, existence in such a controlled environment is exhausting and dehumanizing. ADX Florence challenges the very notion of what incarceration should be. It blurs the line between punishment and psychological experimentation, raising uncomfortable questions about justice, ethics, and the cost of safety. When imprisonment becomes an instrument of mental torment, the prisoner may survive physically, but the human spirit is systematically eroded. In the shadow of the Rockies, ADX Florence remains a stark testament to extreme confinement. It is a place where silence becomes violence and isolation becomes a weapon. The lessons it offers are grim. When control becomes absolute, the human soul suffers. And in this most secure of prisons, suffering is not collateral, it is deliberate. La Santé Prison, situated in the heart of Paris, has long been a symbol of secrecy, power, and the darker undercurrents of justice. For decades, journalists and outsiders were denied entry, creating a veil behind which abuse, neglect, and human suffering thrived. Its reputation for brutality grew silently, with stories of mistreatment trickling out only through whispered accounts from former inmates and clandestine reports from activists. Constructed in the 19th century, La Santé was meant to be a modern correctional facility, emphasizing structure and rehabilitation. Yet over time, neglect and overcrowding transformed it into a place where survival often depended more on cunning and endurance than on adherence to law or morality. Cells were small, dimly lit, and infested with vermin. Ventilation was poor, water systems unreliable, and basic hygiene standards were routinely ignored. In such conditions, disease and despair became part of daily life. Violence was pervasive. Inmates reported attacks by other prisoners, and while guards were present, their intervention was inconsistent. Punishment often came in the form of intimidation, beatings, or arbitrary restrictions on privileges. Fear became a tool not only for controlling the population, but for maintaining the secrecy that shielded administrative failings. Silence was enforced not merely for order, but as a means of perpetuating unaccountability. Executions once took place inside La Santé, conducted in the early morning hours, hidden from public view. The deliberate concealment of such acts reinforced the prison's aura of intimidation and secrecy. Families and the wider society were left unaware, ensuring that the moral cost of punishment remained abstract. This veil allowed administrators to operate with minimal scrutiny, further entrenching practices that would be deemed unacceptable elsewhere. Over the years, public pressure, legal action, and investigative journalism forced gradual reforms. Improvements in sanitation, medical care, and visitation policies slowly reshaped the institution. Yet the legacy of secrecy continues to cast a shadow, reminding the world that opacity in prisons enables abuse to flourish unchecked. La Santé demonstrates a profound human cost of institutional secrecy. Beyond the visible walls and gated entrances lies a moral dimension that often escapes oversight: the psychological toll of fear, isolation, and systematic neglect. It is a reminder that prisons do more than house criminals. They reflect societal values, priorities, and blind spots. Remembering La Santé is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity. It is a moral imperative to ensure transparency, accountability, and humanity within all correctional systems. Secrecy is the prison system's most potent weapon, and vigilance is the only antidote. Deep in the Russian landscape, near the border of Kazakhstan, lies Black Dolphin Prison, a facility designed to house the nation's most dangerous and incorrigible criminals. It is a place where human dignity is systematically stripped away, and the concept of hope is virtually eliminated. Inmates are held under constant surveillance, hooded during transfers, and subjected to rigorous routines intended to erase individuality and enforce total obedience. The prison population consists of murderers, terrorists, and repeat offenders whose crimes have earned them life sentences. The expectation here is that inmates will spend the remainder of their existence behind thick concrete walls, with no possibility of release or redemption. Black Dolphin operates not merely as a correctional facility, but as an institution built to extinguish the human spirit. Inmates live under strict rules from dawn to dusk. Their movements are tightly controlled. Every gesture, every posture is monitored. Sleep, meals, and exercise occur under supervision. Privacy is virtually non-existent. Even minor infractions, from speaking out of turn to minor lapses in behavior, are met with immediate punishment. Guards maintain authority through both intimidation and meticulous regulation of routine. Physical confinement is paired with psychological control. Prisoners are kept isolated for extended periods and constantly reminded of their status. Interaction is limited, and friendships, if they form, are carefully observed. These measures foster a climate of fear, uncertainty, and mental strain. In such an environment, resistance is not openly expressed, but it simmers silently, buried under the weight of discipline. The architecture of Black Dolphin itself is a tool of control. Cells are arranged to facilitate constant observation. Prisoners are moved in pairs, always under watch. The design eliminates the possibility of spontaneous escape, rebellion, or unmonitored interaction. The walls are not merely barriers. They are instruments of psychological dominance, enforcing compliance at every turn. Black Dolphin embodies the extreme of punitive philosophy, a system where security and control outweigh rehabilitation. Ethical questions abound. While the prison undoubtedly protects society from dangerous individuals, it does so by employing methods that some argue constitute cruelty. The erosion of autonomy, prolonged psychological stress, and absence of hope illustrate the human cost of absolute control. Inmates at Black Dolphin are not just confined. They are systematically defined by their criminal identity, with every aspect of life structured to reinforce that identity and suppress individuality. This extreme approach forces reflection on the balance between justice, security, and humanity. When confinement becomes total, when hope is forbidden, the prison becomes more than a place of punishment. It becomes a crucible of despair. Across continents and centuries, notorious prisons exhibit common patterns that reveal much about human behavior, governance, and societal values. Despite differences in architecture, political context, or era, these institutions share traits: secrecy, isolation, dehumanization, and unchecked authority. The repetition of these features demonstrates that the human cost of incarceration is not limited to specific cultures, but is embedded in the very concept of confinement when oversight fails. Isolation is perhaps the most consistent pattern. From Alcatraz to ADX Florence, solitary confinement is employed as a tool to dominate not just bodies, but minds. Extended isolation erodes psychological resilience, induces paranoia, and fractures social cohesion. Inmates may retain physical health, but the mind suffers profoundly. Prolonged silence and enforced solitude reveal the human psyche's vulnerability to environmental control, making isolation a subtle yet devastating weapon. Secrecy and lack of transparency also recur. La Sante, the Bastille, and Black Dolphin all thrived on invisibility. When outsiders are barred, abuses multiply, unchecked by law, media, or public scrutiny. Violence, neglect, and arbitrary punishment persist precisely because accountability is absent. The walls do not merely confine inmates. They shield systemic cruelty from observation and criticism, creating a climate in which injustice becomes routine. Dehumanization is another universal pattern. Inmates are reduced to numbers, uniforms, or shadows. Their histories, families, and identities are stripped away. Control over sleep, movement, and even thought is normalized. Carandiru's overcrowding, Robben Island's enforced labor, and Black Dolphin's constant surveillance demonstrate how systematic policies enforce invisibility and obedience. Humanity is subordinated to administrative convenience, power, and perceived security. Unchecked authority within prisons magnifies these effects. Guards, administrators, and bureaucrats wield power without sufficient oversight, sometimes resulting in brutal outcomes. Carandiru's massacre illustrates how unmonitored control can escalate catastrophically. Even in democracies, institutions like ADX Florence highlight the tension between security and ethics, showing that without constraints, authority can inflict profound harm under guise of legality. These patterns also impact society outside prison walls. Prisons normalize cruelty, reinforce hierarchies, and teach communities that certain populations are expendable. They shape public perception of justice, influencing tolerance for extreme measures. The ripple effects extend far beyond the cells themselves, affecting social morality and the legal framework that governs behavior. Understanding these recurring themes is crucial for reform. Isolation, secrecy, dehumanization, and unaccountable power are not inevitable. They are choices made by institutions. Recognizing and addressing these patterns allows for the possibility of humane incarceration that balances security with dignity. Hidden patterns of abuse remind us that prisons are mirrors of societal values. They expose the ethical cost of neglect, the fragility of oversight, and enduring human consequences of confinement mismanaged or misapplied. Prisons are more than physical spaces. They are reflections of societal values, moral boundaries, and political priorities. From the Bastille to Black Dolphin, from Robben Island to Carandiru, the world's most notorious jails offer lessons that extend far beyond the walls, bars, and cells. Understanding these institutions is essential, not only to remember the past, but to shape a more humane future. Every prison tells a story of power and control. They reveal how authority can be exercised without transparency, how isolation can be weaponized, and how dehumanization can be normalized. Inmates are often reduced to statistics, numbers, or labels, and their suffering hidden from public view. Yet these stories are not only about cruelty, they are about resilience, endurance, and the human spirit's capacity to survive even under the harshest conditions. Remembering notorious prisons matters because it forces society to confront uncomfortable truths. When punishment becomes spectacle, justice loses meaning. When suffering is hidden behind walls, moral standards erode. From the psychological torment of ADX Florence to the systemic neglect of La Sante, these institutions illustrate the cost of prioritizing control over humanity. They demonstrate that a failure to balance punishment with dignity results not only in human suffering, but in societal corruption. Moreover, these stories serve as cautionary tales. Governments and prison systems often justify extreme measures in the name of security. Yet history repeatedly shows that unchecked authority, secrecy, and inhumane treatment breed not compliance, but further oppression, unrest, and sometimes tragedy. The massacres, psychological breakdowns, and acts of courage documented in notorious jails provide insight into the limits of human tolerance and the consequences of institutional failure. The significance extends to the ethical framework of modern justice systems. How society treats its prisoners reflects its commitment to human rights, equity, and fairness. By examining the failures and abuses of notorious jails, policymakers, citizens, and prison administrators can identify patterns of harm, advocate for transparency, and implement reforms that protect dignity without compromising security. Finally, these stories remind us of the resilience of a human spirit. From Mandela's endurance on Robben Island to those who survived Alcatraz's psychological torment, they demonstrate that even in environments designed to break the human will, hope and resistance endure. Understanding their experiences encourages empathy and awareness, reinforcing the principle that justice should serve humanity rather than diminish it. Looking beyond the bars, the moral of these narratives is clear. Accountability, transparency, and respect for human dignity are essential in any penal system. Justice without humanity becomes oppression. The stories of the world's most notorious prisons challenge us to reflect, reform, and remember. They compel us to recognize that what happens behind closed doors not only shapes lives within, but defines the ethical character of society outside. By telling these stories, we honor those who suffered, illuminate systemic flaws, and underscore the enduring lesson. Humanity must never be sacrificed in the name of control, punishment, or fear. Subscribe to the Crit Stories for more untold histories, shocking revelations, and deep dives into the world's hidden truths.